People are still arriving. So welcome, everyone. This is our Monday Live lecture for October the 17th. Today we have Darcia Narvaez speaking on the ethics of early life care. I'm really thrilled to have Darcia with us. I have been reading her books, and I really can't put them down, so I highly recommend that you check out Darcia. She has a blog. That's how I first met her, when she started writing about the 10 things that we need to know about babies. Darcia Narvaez is a professor of the Department of Psychology at the University of Notre Dame. Her prior careers include professional musician, classroom music teacher, business owner, seminarian, and middle school Spanish teacher. Dr. Narvaez's current research explores how early life experience influences societal culture and moral culture in children and adults. She is the author or editor of dozens of books, chapters, and articles. One of her recent books, Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality, Evolution, Culture, and Wisdom, won the 2015 William James Book Award from the American Psychological Association and from the American Education Research Association. She is the editor of the Journal of Moral Education. She also writes a popular blog, that's the one that I saw, for Psychology Today, called Moral Landscape. She's one of the few professionals that are really thoroughly addressing ethics and morals in our field. Please welcome Darcia.
Thank you so much, Kate. Glad to be here with you all. I have lots to say, so I will be going fast through some things, but hopefully you have the handout so you can ponder some of the issues more later. So let's get started with the PowerPoint here. I'm going to be talking about early life care and argue that it's an ethical issue of providing what children evolve to need. So first is the disclosures that needs to be, you can see this on the handout where royalties come from. All right, so we know every animal has a nest. Humans do too. And we know that when you have a species-typical nest or developmental system of development, caregiving and parenting, that you turn out to be a smart, effective creature, and that's a species-typical outcome. And for humans, we have this kind of nest. I call it companionship care, and we're going to go through these things carefully in this hour. But you can see that there's a lot of things that our nest is supposed to be that we're really not providing young children anymore. But why is it so important? Why do we need all these things that we'll discuss momentarily? Well, if you look at this PowerPoint slide here, you can see on the left column all the apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimps, bonobos, humans too. Small band hunter-gatherers, you see there on the left side, that's 99% of our history was spent in that kind of community. And if you look across the top, you can see how long people or individuals spend in the womb, gestation, the brain volume at birth compared to adult size, when menstruation starts, eruption of first and last teeth, and those are cognitive developmental signals, average length of breastfeeding or nursing, completion of general physical growth, and maximum lifespan. So then if you look at the humans, if you do the comparisons across the apes, you can see that the humans have the smallest amount of brain developed at birth, that we have the menarche comes later, the eruption of teeth. We have a wider range across those growth measures. And so humans are really immature for a very long time. We don't become adults really till age 20 on this in this chart, but the neuroscientists now today would say not till about age 30 because of those prefrontal cortex, those executive functions are not completing themselves till around age 30. So there's a lot that humans need compared to other animals. So let's go on. What does that mean then? We're born very immature, only 25% of the brain developed. Well, we are biosocially constructed after birth. That means our biology is shaped by our social experience, and our social experience then and our social capacities are undergirded by our biology. So we're an integrative kind of dynamic system that's developing in those early years that are going to, and what happens in those early years affects the trajectory that we take. Are we going to be species typical, or are we going to be species atypical? And as a result, all of our capacities are influenced by those early years, those first years. We're developmentally plastic, and there's this constant interaction. Every moment of the day for that baby, there's an interaction between nature and nurture, because the baby's growing so rapidly, they're a different baby from 5 minutes ago, right? And so their experience in the next 5 minutes is going to have a different impact on who they become. So timing, duration, intensity of experience really matters. And so we know that epigenetically, all sorts of things are happening. That means genes, this little blueprint you're born with, are being turned on or off according to schedules of maturation and according to the experience you're having at that time. And all sorts of things are affected. Your emotion systems, your sense of self, how you look at the world. These are all things related to your ethical orientations and your moral capacities later. So in early childhood, we know that we're born 9 to 18 months early compared to other animals. We can't go around and start foraging for food until about 18 months. So we really should be in the womb another that many more months. Don't tell the moms that. Don't tell any pregnant women that. It's kind of a shock. But really that indicates, it's an indicator of how sensitive those months are. And a lot of what's happening, Alan Shore's work has pointed out, the right hemisphere, the right brain development is occurring during these periods, this early phases. And those undergird our capacities for getting along with others, for being able to be emotionally attuned to others and with things that are going on around us, being aware of the wholeness and the bigness of life. All that's the right hemisphere stuff. When you undermine that early development, which we're going to talk about in a moment, what those things are, then you're undermining right hemisphere development. You're sort of making a half human then. The immune system, too, takes about 6 years to develop. Breast milk has all the immunoglobulins that you need to build the immune system. So we'll see that on average, breastfeeding should last about that long. I know, it's a shock. But so I'm telling you all this stuff. I put all these pieces together, and it's rather astounding how much we've forgotten about who we are and what babies need. So, in fact, caregivers are co-constructing that body, the brain, the psyche, all sorts of things that are developing rapidly, shaped through caregiving experiences and through the kinds of physical communications that the mother provides, how she wiggles when the baby's getting uncomfortable in her arms, and she shapes her holding of that child, and so on. So really the ethical versus unethical piece here, I'm going to argue, and in the end we'll say more stridently maybe what unethical is. But if we're going to be ethical about how we care for children, we need to provide what babies need to grow well. And when we don't do that, we are behaving unethically. So our companionship nest includes touch, responsivity, breastfeeding alloparents, positive social support, play, soothing perinatal experiences, all these things, and we're going through each one now, and probably more things, but these are the minimum, and the things that we're studying in my lab, we're finding are related to your well-being as a child, your well-being as an adult, your social capacities as a child, your social capacities as an adult, your moral orientation. Are you open-hearted, or are you self-protective and bracing against the world, or as a child or as an adult? Again, every animal has that nest, that species nest. So let's look now at responsiveness. This is being prompt in responding to needs of the child. So it's actually responding before the child cries. That's a late signal for a baby. So you shouldn't even have babies cry. They don't traditionally cry in traditional communities. Somehow we've gotten the idea that you have to wait for the baby to cry to know what they need or that they have a problem. No, no, no. So responsiveness is a reciprocal communication between the caregiver and the mother and the child. It's a synchrony, tuning into the eye contact and signaling back and forth, having a conversation that's nonverbal, and being influenced by the other. So, if, when one is a little more excited, then the partner is excited too, or, calm when it's time to be calm. And so there's sort of a shared relationship that builds little patterns of back and forth, little narratives of how we do things together, how we play together. And it's really about meeting the child's needs in the moment. We know that sensitive responsive care establishes the brain wiring, emotional regulation, all sorts of habitual patterns for these systems and others through that relational synchrony. That shared intersubjectivity means the kind of the mind meld from Star Trek. You're sharing, brain to brain. Limbic resonance is another form of that. It's when you have that fuzzy, warm feeling that you have with one another, and you mutually co-regulate each other. And some people talk about this for a baby as an external umbilical cord. For example, what happens with good responsive care is that vagus nerve gets established well. It's the 10th cranial nerve that connects to major body systems, and it needs to be built up or established in its patterns of the parameters for functioning by caregivers. Tune up that vagus nerve. It happens from being responsive and keeping the baby calm as much as possible, and that sets up a good vagal tone, and good vagal tone then helps all those systems work well. Poor vagal tone, though, results from non-responsive or inconsistently responsive parenting. And we need good vagal tone to be able to be intimate with others. Otherwise, we get too panicked when we get too close to someone else. And it also undergirds our compassionate response to others. Good vagal tone is critical then for all these systems, and these physiological effects of responsiveness affects also the epigenetics of turning on genes to control anxiety for life. Lots of rat studies showing that and showing similar things for human beings. And the stress response. So stress response is being established in early life too. How is it going to act? Is it going to be well, healthily responsive and getting back to stability or homeostasis after a stressor, or is it going to get freaked out and stay overreactive, or be overreactive generally to threats and just never settle down? So that's something that parents, again, caregivers, are helping establish well or poorly. And in terms of social and moral capacities, we know that mutually responsive orientations lead to secure attachment. That means those are neurobiological capacities for social relationships. And these kinds of characteristics then are related to a combination of responsiveness and secure attachment. Empathy, self-regulation, conscience, openness, agency, and self-efficacy. One of the dominant examples of non-responsiveness is the cried-out sleep training, where a distressed baby is going to have its brain flooded with toxic hormones. Cortisol at high levels over long periods will kill off, melt synapses essentially, and change gene expression, and potentially permanently affect that child's well-being. So it can lead to oversensitivity and hyperreactivity. It can lead to clinical depression, anxiety later, and accelerated aging and mortality. So you don't want to be doing this, but we know that babies routinely left to cry alone end up with extensive distress. They stop growing, stop feeling, stop trusting. And you can see it in the physiology that's happening. No time to talk about it here. But what you want to do to be responsive is respond before the baby gets distressed. So when they start to make a face, when they start to wiggle funny, that means they're already signaling that they need something different. And so the responsive caregiver will move in and change what's happening for that child. And they're more likely, when you're responsive, have responsive parents, you're more likely to be an independent child than a dependent child, the opposite of what the cultural beliefs are in many quarters of our society. So with responsiveness, you're going to have better stress regulation, a better ability to self-regulate your arousal systems, you're going to be happier, you're going to have heightened moral functioning as the kinds of things that I focus on, empathy, conscience, compassion, and cooperation. All right, then there's touch. It's the second part of our nest. Babies are expecting to be held or kept near others constantly, so they expect to be rocked and carried and touched virtually all the time in those early months. that mammals in general need touch to grow and synthesize DNA, and that when you separate a mammal baby from the mother, it dysregulates multiple systems, and it can change things lifelong again in stress reactivity, and can create deficits of that lead to impulsive, violent, and antisocial behavior or depression. Physical separation, we know, increases pain and decreases opioids and oxytocin, those nice, cuddly, happy kind of hormones. And during sensitive periods, it's going to have epigenetic effects. As I mentioned earlier, there are going to be genes that are not turned on or turned off. And if you pass that sensitive period, you missed it. There's no way to alter it later except by taking drugs. So there's long-lasting effects of physical touch, prevents that excessive stress, or hippocampal dysfunction even. That's a memory system. Prevents eventual depression. And skin-to-skin contact, as you probably know, promotes healthy sleep cycles and behavioral arousal of the right kind. Exploratory activities, when a child feels safe, they're going to explore and look around. Social and cognitive functioning, and calming. I had a student who read the Science of Parenting book, and he was at a family party after he graduated, and emailed me later about this, and said he was at a party where a baby was crying and no one could console the baby, and so he remembered the skin-to-skin thing, and so he just picked up the baby and held the baby to his neck, which was the only part of his body, I guess, exposed, and the baby quieted down. One study, they had 4 conditions at birth for babies and mothers. They separated, the first condition was baby was put on the mother's chest, skin to skin. The second condition was the baby was swaddled, put in the mother's arms. Third condition, the baby was swaddled, put nearby. The fourth condition was the baby was swaddled and put down the hall. And they came back 1 year later, and they found that the babies who had experienced skin-to-skin contact were in the best shape. And then the second best was the ones who were swaddled in the mother's arms. And the skin-to-skin babies were more self-regulated. They had more attuned relationship with their mothers. And interestingly, the negative influence of swaddling in arms, which wasn't as good as skin-to-skin, was mitigated by breastfeeding within the first few hours of birth. So let's look at breastfeeding. In our ancestral condition, our 99% of our history, breastfeeding was for 2 to 5 years on average, even up to 8 years. You know, it's a shock for us. We can't imagine it. You get all sorts of negative attention if you're breastfeeding your toddler, right? But this is what we evolved to need. In the first year, in the first few months of life, you need to be feeding every few minutes, every 20 minutes on average, because the stomach is so small. Breast milk has the ingredients to build a human being. So infants are born with gastric enzymes that are only for digesting breast milk and not for anything else. Every mammal has a specific kind of milk for its own young. Human breast milk is thin, not thick, and so it requires frequent ingestion. It's meant to bathe the brain with hormones of all sorts while it's growing so rapidly, thousands of synapses a minute. And it's mostly lactose, unlike cow's milk, which has a different balance, which has more protein in it. And the AAP recommends human breast milk as a gold standard against any alternative in food. It's 80% alive. It's got a balanced spectrum of macro and micronutrients, enzymes, growth factors, hormones, probiotics for brain development and gut function. It's got protective agents, 5 basic immunoglobulins, and it's also a magic kind of machine because the infant's saliva will signal to the mother's breast what's needed. If there's a disease going around in the neighborhood, the mother will produce antibodies for it. If the baby is going through a growth spurt, the breast milk will be more laden with fat. So the length, 2 to 5 years, up to 8 years, recorded by anthropologists in our small band hunter-gatherer communities. And I'm on my husband's computer, so he's got messages coming up here. So really, we need 5 years or so for that immune system to develop to reach adult levels. So you can see why breast milk then is related to having a good immune function. We know all sorts of things about long-term breast milk, although most studies are studying 3 months of breastfeeding and comparing that to infant formula, which is kind of inadequate. But we know that you have generally more higher IQ when they have done a 9-month study, greater visual acuity at 9 months, overall better health of all sorts. And breastfeeding versus formula, we know that the gut flora is different with formula-fed babies. We know now that just bottle feeding, it doesn't give the same kind of eye-to-eye contact, tactile stimulation, mutual touch often. I mean, you can do it that way, but a lot of times I see people feeding their babies bottles like they're filling up a gas tank. So they're not really looking at the child, they're not holding and gazing. And so that's also affecting brain development. And then there's all sorts of specific things that breast milk protects against, and the government has issued many reports on this. I'll read through it all. You can look at it in the handout. And one of the things that it has in the night milk is tryptophan. It's a precursor to serotonin. Serotonin is key for neuronal signaling, which is what good, intelligent brains do is they signal quickly. And serotonin is key for immune system because most of the serotonin receptors you have are in your gut. So that's kind of interesting. All right, so there's just a lot more different details here. I'm not going to read them all. And a lot of good outcomes from breast milk. Just look at the chart now. This is kind of interesting. So in our primate cousins, our ape cousins, on average, will have a range from 0 to 6 years of breastfeeding, usually in the average of 4 years. Our ancestors and cousins, small band hunter-gatherers, have a range of 8 years, average age of weaning of 4 at 4 years old. World Health Organization recommends 2 years minimum of breastfeeding. American Academy of Pediatrics 1 year because they don't think American mothers will do it any longer. So, in general, that formula has a limited set of ingredients, just a couple dozen at most, in the wrong proportions. They're not human. Breastfeeding, of course, breast milk has human and correct proportions of things. Breast milk promotes health and optimal growth. And that's probably it. So let's go on to number 4, soothing perinatal experiences. That means you don't distress the child at birth. What does that mean? What does it look like? Following natural rhythms of the mother and child. No interference with the timing of the birth. No drugs. A calming, welcoming environment like the Le Boyer method, for example. No separation of mom and baby. No painful procedures. Now, most births now in the USA do not follow this. They're not soothing, they're traumatic instead. The current hospital practices in the USA since World War II are medicalized, so we have highest infant and maternal mortality rates for advanced nations, and we have all sorts of painful procedures that began. Assume that babies really, they don't feel any pain. We've got painful procedures like circumcision, which is a whole other bag to talk about, but that is, in my view, an unethical thing to do. Some Jewish communities are coming up with alternatives to circumcision to welcome their babies into the community because there's evidence of all sorts of psychological and physiological effects of circumcision, infant circumcision. And there's suction, shots, pinpricks, bright lights, noxious odors, rough blankets. You et al. Did a review of these things and showed that they were detrimental to babies' development. And this kind of stress is going to impact that very early developing brain that's very sensitive to the environment, as I said earlier. So these stress experiences can become permanently ingrained and will be in the brain because the brain is recording all of the experiences the child has, especially in the early Got cesarean births over 30%. Still holding around 33% in the USA, and various evidence now showing that cesarean births can interfere with physiological responsiveness of the mother to the newborn. They don't recognize their cry, or their brain doesn't show as much activation as as vaginally born mothers do to their children. And C-sections circumvent the ecstatic wash of hormones that normally occurs with vaginal birth. That's natural, that's not interfered with. And so on, there's more things. Bonding disruption. And so that entrainment, there's something about that first hour after birth that seems to be a magical hour. And you know, when you first meet somebody, that first impression is so important. It sticks with you often. And especially for a young baby and a mother in that very amazing state of birth, are going to have a significant bonding if you allow it to happen. All right, number 5, maternal support. Allo parents, so allo mothers usually is the term used. My colleagues and I sometimes say allo parents so that people don't think it's only females. But we evolved to be raised in a community of allo mothers or allo parents. And Sarah Hurdy, that's how you spell her name, she's an anthropologist, labels it cooperative breeding. And she notes the findings that mothers really need support to be able to be responsive to their children. So if mothers, and this is any animal, don't feel supported by the community, but especially humans, because we need that. The babies need so much care, really need other people around. Mothers will be less attentive if they don't feel like the community is supporting them. So we can see a lot of that happening in our country, where parents, mothers, fathers, children are not very well supported by the communities or the government, unlike in Western Europe, where you get parental leave for a year, 2, 3 years, and you get somebody coming to do your laundry after the birth, and coming to cook meals for you, and on and on. So mothers perceive social supports correlated with social skills and behavior problems negatively, and in kindergartners, the children seem to be more competent in the eyes of the teachers. So the more social support we can provide mothers, the better it is for the children and the mother. Yuri Bronfenbrenner has what he called an ecological systems theory, and he pointed out with diagrams like this of how the child is embedded in rings of support or non-support, or interactive rings or systems of care. And you can see that the family and school, they're all interacting with one another in the microsystem, the mesosystem. So how that parents' work environment supports them being a parent is going to matter to the effect that child's outcomes. You can have a lack of social support. We know mothers have greater maternal stress. It's going to interfere with nurturing behaviors. They're, of course, negatively influencing the child outcomes. Those who report less effective in maternal support have infants with more insecure attachment styles. That means there's a neurobiological engraving of what's going on, and they carry that with them, and unless there's some nice intervention later. There are other sensitive periods, early adolescence, college years. Those are other times when you can have significant relational experiences that reshape your brain. So it's not completely determined by the early years, but those are fundamental. And then single parenthood, because of the lack of support of that mother-child relationship, is going to be a risk factor as well. Allo parents are going to be able to provide responsiveness, touch, skin-to-skin contact especially too, play, and a positive climate, which we're going to talk about also. And they give mom support too, of course. We have a number of studies that show that when first-time mothers are visited by nurses or supportive personnel over, in this case, 24 times before and after birth until age 2, the children become less emotionally reactive compared to children who weren't visited. They have greater language learning and greater cognitive development, even into adolescence. So we know this is really important. It's just hard for people to do it now. Governments don't want to pay for these things in our country. And We have working parents, and so we just don't have the system set up. So we need to make changes that way. Number 6, play. Excuse me. Self-directed, free play, I mean. So this means the playful interactions the child chooses in the moment. And usually that means running around, running up a tree, playing tag, wrestling and doing somersaults. That's the kind of self-directed free play, not sports that are directed by adults. And we know that this self-directed free play will facilitate emotion regulation. It's going to influence gene expression, so you, in a way that facilitates positive growth and fosters brain development, especially in those executive functions that help you control yourself, that help you build empathy, that help you understand the consequences of your actions. Play is fragile. It's reduced by negative emotions, so you know when a child is afraid, angry, or anxious. When they're sick, in pain, or hungry, they're not going to play. So it suggests that play needs a sense of safety. It's robust because when young mammals are feeling well and good and have the opportunity, they nearly always play. So it's a good sign to see your children playing. So accept and Byron say it's an exceptionally sensitive measure for all things bad. And I know therapists, when they have a couple come in, they note how playful they are, and the course of therapy goes well when they start to become playful. So play has epigenetic growth effects on various things like metabolism, turning on genes. The energizing hormone is secreted during play, which probably shapes them in prosocial ways, because you have to play, when you play with another person, you have to play in a prosocial way or they'll stop playing with you. So you're learning habits of playing fairly and kindly. And there are arguments that children diagnosed with ADHD, hyperactivity, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, really who don't have a real brain disorder, they're actually maybe play starved or have a strong play system, which is one of the emotion systems in our brain that's undernourished. And it seems like that's pretty widespread now, since I hardly ever see any children outside playing. Active play then leads to difficulty regulating aggressive urges, all sorts of altered interactions with peers, behavioral disorders, academic achievement is diminished, increased aggression. The status in the USA, it's been disappearing in kindergarten. In elementary schools, they've eliminated recess. And educators, the adults now, are having trouble distinguishing play from aggression because it's so rare and so under-provided or under-allowed. And then finally, we have the positive climate of support. In this kind of a climate, you're going to have more positive than negative emotions, more joy, serenity, expansiveness, and less sadness, anger, fear, humiliation. And what we find is that adults who report more of those positive emotions in childhood show more secure attachment, mental health, less distress, and they're less likely to have this bracing, self-protective morality. In this climate, you're going to feel loved, cherished, and appreciated, and you're able to create a positive reaction in others. So when you make a joke or you smile, the other person will smile back. And that's really important for that child to feel like they have a positive impact. And in the positive social climate, hopefully you also have deep friendships and deep relationships of support. Our human heritage is positive climate and social play. This is what traditional communities do regularly together. Singing and dancing, laughing and teasing, telling jokes and stories, sitting close. And we know that these kinds of things are going to keep you in a good mood, keep you in a happy mood of being contented with oxytocin, prolactin, serotonin flowing. So I use as a baseline our nomadic forager heritage. That's 99% of human history was spent in that kind of society. as I said, and in those societies, you can see that they spend a lot of time in what I call the engagement ethic. That's the relationally attuned way of being. The safety ethic here is that's protectionism. It's that bracing set of being protective and worried about where you're going and who's around you and feeling threatened. So very little of that in this society. In contrast, and I don't have the diagram of what I think our society is, which is the opposite, right? Mostly we spend our time in safety ethic, worried about getting money, worried about, where we're going, how to manage the day, worried. It's not who we are meant to be as human beings. It puts us into a very primitive state of self kind of centeredness on our own family needs, and it doesn't lead us to the ethical orientation that we need to have to give babies what they need. But this is our heritage, is to provide that companionship, caregiving, and you can see that it's part of the first step is giving all those kinds of nest characteristics to children. That's going to then, number 2, build a good physio-neurosocial biology that leads them to become adults who have well-being. So well-being physically, well-being socially, and wisdom. And this is not rare. It was common. This is, in our nomadic foraging communities, you would not survive unless you went through this pattern. And it leads to a community then that attends to basic needs. The basic needs of babies, the basic needs of all of us to have social support and to have a sense of safety with the community. And so then the cycle continues because you are an adult who creates the culture and then supports babies for what they need. Now, in the last 12,000 years or so, we've been moving away. Our last 1% of human genus history, we've moved away from this pattern. And we've moved instead to what I call the cycle of competitive attachment. And I'll show you that in a moment. But and let me just emphasize in the early years, this is so critical. Why the nest is so vital and what's missing, I think, in many of our adults today is this right hemisphere development. It fosters self-regulation of various systems, including the vagus nerve. It helps us develop a sense of social pleasure, social agility, to be with others. We feel safe around others. We don't feel threatened all the time because we know we can get along and we have the emotional intelligence to do that. We feel empathy for others. We are able to be in the moment instead of being preoccupied with our own anxieties, depressions, angers, which develop from not having the nest. So when you don't have the nest, you're going to develop in that way that's not provided the underpinnings of human nature. So we can move into self-transcendence. We don't have such a big ego. We're able to feel connected to everything with the right hemisphere development and into a higher consciousness. But we have moved away from that. We are now providing species atypical developmental systems to our children. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we have all sorts of a huge range of pathology now in children and adults. Species atypical outcomes. It's not who humans are supposed to be, but we've created this mess from, I think, it zeroes in on the early years. So instead of the culture of cooperativeness, we have a culture of a cycle of competitive detachment. And so we provide undercare to young children, so we have developmentally inappropriate child rearing, and I call that undercare. That then leads to poor development of biosocial neurobiology, leading to adults with ill-being. They're sickly and physically. They have all these health issues, but they're also socially kind of not very skilled or agile, a little bit self-protective and uncomfortable with difference, with new things, and they then will have brains that lead them to see threat easily everywhere, and that kind of threat shuts down that kind of stress response reactivity. moves the brain, the blood flow away from your higher order thinking. You don't think as well. You're not going to be open-hearted or open-minded because you're mobilized for threat. So that's fight, flight, freeze, faint. You're going to want to run away. You're going to want to fight. You're going to want to freeze, disappear. And so that's where we end up with limited sociomoral capacities. And then we end up, the adults create a degraded culture where the adults are distracted because they don't have the good underpinnings for being able to deal with things, and they create a culture that actually perpetuates this, makes things worse. Adults who are overwhelmed or over-controlling with their kids are going to be intrusive. They're going to helicopter. And so I think one of the key things that's happened now is we undercare for babies, and then we helicopter the children because we realize, well, they can't take care of themselves. Well, that's because they were undercared for as babies. If you care for them well as babies, they're going to be fine later. Of course, we all need mentoring throughout our lives, though. It's not like we suddenly grow up and we never need an elder to give us some advice. We need it until at least age 30. We need to not put kids or anybody in situations where they have to deal with things as a novice, as a person who doesn't know anything, and we give them too much power. They're going to mess it up and then redevelop bad habits. So in our society, we really have a taboo on tenderness in the early years especially, but throughout life, unlike other places and unlike what humans need. So Ira Seti from the 1930s wrote about this. So the ethical then question or proposal is that I'm wondering if we, and I actually think we do, need a baby bill of rights, because the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of the Child does not cover babies. And we like to say, oh, well, if you have authoritative parenting, that's what everyone needs. That's firm and warm, instead of authoritarian, which is firm and not so warm, or permissive, which is not firm but warm. But the kind of parenting analysis and advocacy that's talked about mostly is not appropriate for babies. Babies need what they need because they need that external womb experience for many months after birth, and then they need that supportive care. They otherwise are going to develop a self-orientation, self-centeredness. So we need then these, I have 13 things here, you probably could add to them, but welcoming, beginning with natural birth at full term. Full term is 40 to 42 weeks. That's been shrinking for some reason. But to follow the routine of the baby. And babies in the womb, I think the range of days in the womb is something like from 255 days to 310 days. Think of that. And so you have to follow what that baby's signals are. The baby signals birth to the mother when labor should start. And for some reason, we have medical personnel deciding when that baby should be born, as they seem to be unaware that there's a big range of how long a baby should be in the womb. No induced pain, no punishment. We find that corporal punishment is also harmful to children. As when we ask adults about their childhoods, they tell us, or when they say they've had corporal punishment, it undermines their well-being, undermines secure attachment, undermines their capacities for empathy and for being open-hearted. Infant-initiated breastfeeding, so this is baby, when they ask for it, are given the breast, not a pacifier, not a blankie. They need the breast, and that's what's comforting to them. Now this is, we got all sorts of issues here, right? Women's rights, workplace issues, on and on and on. So I'm arguing now from a baby, as a baby advocate. Lots of people argue for parents. Lots of people argue for doctors. Lots of people argue for, what's best for society. I'm arguing for babies here. And there's very few people that do. So I'm going to, it sounds extreme, but this is what we evolved to need. And we've decided now, breastfeeding's optional for babies. It is not optional for babies. It might be optional for mom. It's not optional for babies. So we have to figure out how to provide that breast milk. And there's other nations do it. They have wet nurses in the hospital for moms whose milk doesn't come in. They have milk banks. They have various ways to support mothers to be successful at breastfeeding and to make it the cool thing to do. Then we have intensive maternal caregiver contact from birth. It's physical touch, carrying, holding, and separations initiated by the child. Caregivers should be providing that deep bonding and limbic resonance for the child so the brain is developing well. We want babies to grow to their full capacities. If we don't provide these characteristics, these components of the nest to a baby, they're not going to grow to a full human capacity person. And we need those people to solve the problems we face in the world. We need to be treated as an equally important person so that they're treated as if they're just an underdeveloped, fully rights-bearing person. In our many people treat them as, and I see videos of people just treating them like a sack of potatoes, or like they're, don't have any sense of being or dignity or personhood. We need to realize that's not true. They're present. They have a spirit in them, and they're ready to be in the community from the beginning. And they just have to be nurtured in that warm, kind way, so they develop in a warm, kind way. So their needs need to be respected. Number 7, appreciation expressed through positive touch, to be embedded with the activities of the family 24 hours a day. So that means you don't isolate, don't change. I mean, you modify your life when you have a baby to meet the needs of the baby, but you keep the baby with you, so you're carrying them there. You don't have a parent-centered kind of family orientation, and you don't have a baby-centered orientation, but you have a life-centered, baby integrated into the life of the family. Community care, we need the community members to step up. We've got a lot of senior citizens who could come in and be grandparents for all sorts of children who need that. They need the multiple generation, but of course they need to know these practices, and they need to be compassionate and not harsh. We need to give babies and young children as much autonomy as development allows. I talk elsewhere about how when babies receive this nest, they develop the empathy because they're practicing empathy with their mother or their father. They develop a sense of connection, of being respected, of the reverence of their relationship with their caregiver. And that immersion actually builds those same capacities within them. And then when they have that surge of autonomy at age 2, or even age 13, 14, I used to be a middle school teacher, when they have those surges of autonomy, they want to show, wow, I can do this. Yes, I can, And what's called terrible twos in the USA, but it's not. There are people from traditional societies from Latin America say, what's terrible twos? I've never heard of that. Part of the reason is because the children are allowed to do what they want to do. They put them in situations where you don't have to say no, where you don't have to, keep thwarting their will. And that's what you want to have them, full autonomy. When the autonomy surges happen, you want to, if they have the empathy already developed, they're not going to go beyond that. They're not going to go hurt their grandmother because they love their grandmother. They're not going to hurt the people in their community that they grew to love and were supportive of them. And so they go together. Empathy and autonomy go together. They don't, it's not something that we somehow in the West think they're separate. Either for yourself or for the community. No. In the traditional societies, in the hunter-gatherer societies, that's not true. They go together. High autonomy, high empathy, high communal support, high communal commitment. And then the support of the child's spirit. In Native American communities, they try to interfere as little as possible with their young children because they know there's a unique spirit in that child. Just like everything in the world is a unique instance. Every snowflake is different. Every leaf is different on a tree. Every piece of grass is different. So too, humans even more so. We're each unique. And what is that spirit that's developing there? Well, you try to step back and let it develop and support what's there in positive ways. And then finally, the opportunities for full and sensory intellectual development. That means immersion in life, moving around out in the world, in the natural world, integrating a sense of community with the landscape, the local landscape, the mountains, the trees, the animals, so that you actually feel like you're part of the earth. And as I say in the footnote there, sometimes emergencies make us go against these things, but those should be for emergencies, not everyday routine practices. All right, well, I'll stop talking and you can ask questions now, comments.
Okay, that was very provoking and thought-provoking, and it was just wonderful to be exposed to this whole idea of the Bill of Rights for babies and being advocate for babies. So I'm very curious to know, does anyone have a question or come and interact with Darcia? Does anyone have a question? I know that we, just put your hand up, I'll open your mic. And in the chat, one of the students wanted to know if you could go back to the place in development where if you missed that particular stage, you had to take medication later. Do you remember that slide, Darcia, where you talked about
You
that?
want to go to the slide or you want me to just talk about it?
Just talk about it. I think that.
Okay. Yeah. So, right, it's unclear. Our brains are very plastic, and there are many things that we can repair. It's just not clear how much we can repair. So in the studies with animals, where you can do experiments, they find that you can't repair some things, like when genes are supposed to be turned on and you miss the 10 days after birth. If you have a low nurturing rat mother, those genes don't get turned on properly, and you never ever have another chance to do anything about it except with drugs. So there are things like that, like perhaps serotonin receptors, for example, you take depression drugs and so on. But there are other things that can be changed. So if you developed, for example, a obsessive compulsive disorder because you were so anxious from your early experience, that can actually be repaired. You have to, for example, there's Mind and Brain, I think, is a book. This therapist who had a client who was showing a obsessive compulsive disorder through needing to wash her hands a lot. They looked at her in the brain scan, and they saw there was a place where there's a short circuit in the brain. And so what he did is he asked her, okay, yeah, you can go wash your hands, but first put your hands in the garden dirt. And so she did that, and then she would go wash her hands. And then he said, well, put your hands for a minute in the garden dirt. Okay. And then she went and washed her hands. And then he said, well, let's try for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5, and up to 15 minutes. And by the time she reached 15 minutes, they looked at the brain scan, and there was no more short circuiting, and she didn't feel like washing her hands anymore. So there are things that we can do. It's just unclear. We don't know enough about all the things that early experience develops and how much we can repair.
Wow, what a great story. Let's see, we are having people come on the chat, and I'm going to open up the microphones. Jean d'Arc, will you ask your question live so we can hear your voice?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for this great presentation. It's really amazing and quite informative. I just wanted to ask, with regards to the Baby Bill of Rights, is there anything that has been initiated on that front, or is it still theoretical?
I think the International Association for Infant Mental Health has done something along this line. I just can't get a hold of the document, but they've tried to do something not as thorough as my list.
Jean d'Arc, you can just talk into the microphone if you have a question.
No, that's it. Thank you. I just wanted to know whether it's been initiated or not. So that was my question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right, and let's see. We have another person who's asking. The name of the book, Karen, I think is Mind and Brain. Do you remember the author, Darcia?
It was two people. But I'd have to go look. I could run in the next room and find it, but
No, that's okay. We'll stick with you for the last few minutes, and I can look it up, or you can email it to me later.
all right.
So Patricia Weldon has a question here, so I'm just going to open up her microphone. Go ahead, Patricia. Ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I'm just curious to know, when they do the studies on cesarean section, do they distinguish between whether that cesarean section was an elective section or an emergency section? I suppose the reason I'm asking the question is because I would find that they're two totally different presentations.
Yes, I agree with you. So if the mother has already gone through some of the vaginal labor and then have a C-section, it's going to be different because the baby will have been stimulated by trying to get through the vaginal canal, which is, they're thinking now it's a good thing, because other animals, when they're born, a baby's born, the mother licks them thoroughly. But we don't do that, thankfully. We instead they think it's the same kind of stimulation that occurs by going through the vaginal canal. And so I think that part needs to be distinguished. I think these were just regular C-sections, scheduled C-sections, but I have to check the data, the Swain et al. Paper.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then
Okay,
Vicki
thank you.
Jeter. Vicki Jeter has a question. Go ahead, Vicki.
Hi, it's wonderful to meet you, Darcia. I love the whole thing, and I'm going to need to go back because I missed the very beginning. But the part that really grabbed me was your clarity on how we get boomeranged consistently back into primal needs. And I've been thinking about this for a long time because it feels like our society is attempting to operate in a house of cards where we have this overdeveloped forebrain, if you will, as compared to a healthier hindbrain kind of thing. And so what I want to ask you is, do you know if the information you have about the primacy of a healthy hindbrain then making more room for a more balanced moving forward? Because what I keep thinking about is, you know, there's such a prevalence now for like football games and all of these kinds of competitive whatevers, because people are having this drive to fulfill the primal brain. They want to know, you know, I'm the strongest, I'm winning, I'm going to survive. And we do that vicariously all over the place, and we have millions and millions and millions of dollars that get invested into that, where in fact all these other needs, people don't go there, and they don't have this idea like it might be a really good thing to do some of the investment in our teachers and all this other stuff, because there's this drive to have the survival mechanism met. And I'm just interested in knowing if you know of anywhere where people are putting that together and saying, hey, you know, how do we reset this? How do we say, let's look more at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and realize, yes, we need to meet those primal needs and then build on some of the other stuff so that it has a foundation to succeed.
Yeah,
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I would put it a little differently, and I write about this a lot in my 2014 book, Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality. It talks about all that kind of stuff. I don't specifically mention sports, but I mention other things. But I would say instead that what happens in early life, and I didn't put those slides in here, we only had an hour, that what happens instead is you're enhancing those survival systems, so they get tuned up. Because you're providing the social experience to develop the neuronal pathways and synapses for social capacities, you are distressing the baby, so they over-enhance their anger system, their fear system, their panic system, their lust system. Those are very basic ones we're born with. And then you condition them up to be very hyper in control, because you miss the period in those first few years of giving them all the love and attention and kindness that grows the other stuff. The other stuff has to grow after birth. And if you don't give them this nest, it's not going to grow very well. And then you're stuck with a person that has the old stuff, the primitive stuff, overgrown, the more social stuff undergrown, and then because the survival systems are so strong, they overpower the higher order thinking. That's what happens with the stress response. It shuts down. It takes over the brain. So the survival systems take over the brain, and then you think that's what life's about. Up, one down, dominant, submission. And you better be dominant most of the time, or you're a failure, right? So we've gotten into this mess. I think you put your finger right on it. I would just word it in the way I said it.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Oh, we're right at the top of the hour, but we did have someone with one more question. Can you stick out one more question, Darcia?
Sure.
Okay, Dr. Deepti, go ahead.
I want to ask, you have written a set of rights for babies, but I think should these rights be not of the fetus? Should we not think about the rights of the fetus, that when we are in the womb, we have all the rights similar to baby?
Now that's a delicate area. I teach at a Catholic university, and so the abortion issue and all is quite, and the rights of the fetus are quite prominent there. I think all of this, so the rights of the fetus and the baby are all dependent on the community. So that mother has to feel supported, has to feel that they are embedded and loved and cherished, because that then signals her body to signal the fetus that it is loved and cherished. So if she's overstressed, we have data now that shows that if the mother's stressed during pregnancy, that baby's going to be more irritable. Doesn't matter when she was stressed, but if it was, I don't know how long it has to be, but and so there you go. You've already made a person that's going to have a hard time fitting into the community. They're going to have a hard time. The parents are going to have a hard time with an irritable baby. You've already undermined it. So I think it goes back to the community again, and so I think we all have responsibilities to support mothers and treat them kindly so that it transfers to the children and the adults of tomorrow.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Darcia, for an amazing lecture, very stimulating and really in alignment with some of the things we are promoting in our educator program. Next week, we have a discussion on ethical feeding, which is really how the business of birth is supporting unethical behaviors, which fits, again, in this alignment that Darcia talked about today. So please join us for a discussion on ethical feeding next week. And right now, what I'm going to do is turn on all your microphones. I love to hear your voices. So please say goodbye as you head out the door, and we'll see you next week. Okay, goodbye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Darcia.
Thank you, Darcia.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Darcia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Mason, thank you.
Okay.
Welcome.
All right. Yes, I'll post it, Karen. I'll post it in the Facebook page.
You want to wait a minute, Kate? I'll go look for the book.
Sure. If you want to go look for the book.
Yep.
Oh.
See you next week, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Darcia and Kate.
Really wonderful presentation, high quality. I recommend her books too. She's got some fantastic books, and she does a great job organizing conferences. She's just dynamo. Wonderful. Dr. Narvaez is really one of those bright lights in our country.
Can we mail Darcia on her email ID?
You can write her, yeah. She would love to hear from you. And check out her blog, and you can take her blog and put it in your, on your Facebook or your social media or your website. It's just really well done.
Yeah,
Nice.
I was really interested. I didn't get it. This is Susan.
Hi, Susan.
I was really interested in a couple things. One was when she spoke, I practiced a lot of the things that she said as a parent. I breastfed my kids for 6 years. And I attachment parented. I felt like the biggest challenge was socially. There was no community support, and we didn't have parents. I thought that that's a real big stressor for families. I think a lot of times families want to implement and make positive changes, but I think the way the society is set up makes it very challenging. Or if you implement those practices, you're looked askance upon. Or I mentioned that I nursed for 6 years here, but I wouldn't certainly not mention that in a public sphere.
Yeah, I agree. This is a complex situation. Sometimes I really wish we could find the answer in one thing, but I think it's very complex. Like the transgenerational piece, you know, that some of what shows up in our children and babies belongs to the ancestors, and you know, there's multiple areas to come in, and then we have this community aspect. We're very isolated here in the United States in terms of our tribes are hard to find.
Yeah.
There's not one way to parent. No one tells us what the rules are. We kind of have to find out for ourselves, and making that conscious community takes time. And when you're both working parents, or you're living at the speed of 2016, you have to really be very committed and conscious. There are communities like that in our country. There's one here where I live. A group of parents decided they were going to raise their children together, and they live off the land, off the grid, and they do homeschooling, and I think that's kind of what it takes. It is really hard. It's like swimming upstream in our country. So
yeah.
The other thing is, go ahead, Susan.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, I think one can only make small changes that over time. It took a while to get here, so it's going to take a while to implement societal changes that are for the better of everyone.
Well, I think they're coming. They're happening even faster than I thought they would with the support of paid parental leave now. Even smaller companies are jumping on that bandwagon. We're starting to realize we've got to support our mothers and our families with newborn. And I think it's very stressful to go back to work after having a baby. Moms don't want to leave their babies. Dads don't want to leave their babies. You know, it's if they could find a gentler way of living. Our country is we used to call it the hardship post. I spent many years living in Africa, and we used to call the United States the hardship post, because when you lived in Africa, you always had someone to cook for you, someone who would help you. You were expected to have people hire people. Like my husband and I had to learn that because we weren't used to having people work for us. We were considered kind of rude when we moved there.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we found that out, and we hired a cook, and we hired someone to clean, and we felt really like amazing. It was amazing to have that kind of support. And it's built into their culture. And I learned an awful lot about families and children living in Africa. So but when you're over there, of course, there's so much more disease and poverty and war and instability. So it's, how do we find that balance? And I think we're heading. I see an increase in parental leave, and I see increases in breastfeeding, and I see an increase in the baby-friendly method. We still have a hard time with the midwifery model of care and birthing practices, but.
Yeah, but I think I also see, I hope you don't mind me talking.
No.
Because as a childbirth educator, I do see, like when I speak of things in class along these lines, that there's not a general consensus. Like a lot of parents, I guess what she's saying, like, how she said that when you're up to 30, people need mentors, right? Like I think even with young couples, or any couple having a child, there's not a social, like you said, expectation which holds them. So like I see a lot of people that they go back to work and they have even though I've talked about the baby's brain and 2 years, I've heard moms say things like, well, the baby will be fine, but what about me? Or, I think that there's a real conflict and a real push. I think women don't feel comfortable staying home and not going to work because I don't think it's valued to do that. Does that make sense? Like they don't feel safe to make that choice.
They feel judged. They'll feel judged. Well, yeah, I think it is. I encounter women who feel fortunate that they can stay home. I had a woman in my office the other day who's made that commitment. She feels really fortunate. So I also find women who feel the opposite. I don't know if it's an opposite.
Of course, there's someone that feel the opposite, but I think that it comes at a price because it's not valued. Does that make sense? Like,
yes, it does. No, you're right. No,
if it's not valued, or you're not protected from losing your job, or you can't go back part-time. Like, I see a lot of moms that really can't get part-time work. Like, you got to work 40 plus hours a week, or if they have part-time work, they can't really get part-time work.
Yeah, I want to say something.
Yeah.
I'm Diti. I want to say, the planning in pregnancy, if the pregnancy is planned that way, if we already plan all these things and we think about community support and whatever is there beforehand, before conception, so these problems would better be sorted out beforehand. After conceiving, after having baby, thinking about these things, I think is some sort of irresponsibility, maybe. What do you say?
I disagree. I mean, I think I agree with you. That's ideal. But if we're talking about people coming from primal imprints, from societies, I mean, that's really held by the elders. I mean, the elders in society should be directing people of childbearing age, because a lot of people get pregnant and they're not aware, or people want to do what is valued in society, so they don't think about that. So I don't disagree that what you're saying is right. I think, yeah, it's really good to plan. But as someone who got pregnant with her first child and wasn't quite prepared, I can look back on that and go, well, there were no signs saying this was important or that you should do this or it happened before. And I think that's ideal, but there has to be a container to hold the more than 50% of pregnancies that are not planned. And even people who plan don't. I think they put their attention is in a certain area. Does that make sense?
They don't put attention to these things. Even if they plan, they are paying attention to things which are not that important actually for the moral and mental development of the baby. Exactly. They are thinking in terms of money and means whatever can be in physical terms, means whatever can be given to the baby. They are not thinking in that, supporting the baby that way mentally.
Listen, I love the conversation, but I really need to go. But and we can definitely talk about these things on student check-ins. I hope you all would consider coming to those. And also, we have Dr. Narvaez said that she would send me the name of the book. She couldn't find it, and she'll email it to me, and I'll make sure that people here know that.
This was super fabulous, the whole format, everything. Thank you so much.
Yes, we have so many great lectures this year, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next time. Bye.
Yes. Okay.